Hello students, welcome to Crash King online classes. We'll move to the next lesson of physics, that is friction. So we'll consider some of the everyday life situation. When driver applies brake suddenly to a vehicle or a bus, the bus slows down its speed and it stops. Bus stops after traveling a certain distance. When you apply brake to bicycle travels a certain distance, its speed decreases and it stops. If you consider a rolling ball, the ball which rolls on the ground, after traveling a certain distance, ball stops. But what makes these motion to stop? What makes it may be a ball or bus or bicycle to stop? Which force is responsible to stop these motions? So, we shall discuss the answers for these questions in this lesson, that is friction. Consider this book which is at stationary position, which is not moving. Now I apply some force on this book. I apply the force in the forward direction by pushing the book. So when I push the book in the forward direction, book moves a certain distance and it stops. After moving a certain distance, book stops. So when I push it in the forward direction, when I apply the force in the forward direction, book moves in the forward direction and it stops. But what makes this book to stop? What is responsible to stop this book? So this is because there is a force exists between the surface of the book and this table. The force which is exists between the surface of this book and the table. So this force we call it as frictional force. So consider if you apply force in the forward direction, if you push the book in the forward direction, then frictional force exists in the backward direction. If I push the book in the backward direction, then the frictional force exists in the forward direction. So, when you push the book in the forward direction, because of the friction, book stops. So, frictional force exists in the backward direction. When you push the book in the backward direction, frictional force acts in the forward direction. So, how you can define this frictional force? The force which is opposing the motion of this book or the motion of any object. The force which opposes the motion of the object, we call it as frictional force. The force which is always opposes the movement of the body is called frictional force. So, the force exists between the surface of this book and the table. That is the frictional force. Because of this friction, the movement stops after traveling a certain distance. So you have remember here, if you apply the force in the forward direction, frictional force applied in the backward direction. If you apply the force in the backward direction, frictional force exists or it is applied in the forward direction. So always frictional force is opposite to the motion of a body. So as we have studied, what is friction? Friction is a force which resists to the motion of a body, which decreases the speed of the body, which opposes the speed of the body, which opposes the motion of the body. So frictional force is a force which opposes the motion of a body. So this frictional force or the friction mainly depends on two factors. There are two factors on which force of friction depends. They are, first one is nature of the surfaces of the body and the second one is the mass of the object. So the factors which affects friction are nature of the surface and the second one mass of the object. So we will discuss this how nature of the surface affects the friction by conducting some activities. So we perform this activity to understand how nature of the surface depends on friction. Make an inclined plane by taking some support and a cardboard. So this cardboard has two surfaces in this. One side is polished one side is polished surface and another side is rough surface. You make an inclined plane using a polished surface. This is softer. This is a soft surface compared to the one more surface. Now take an object, any object, and just make it to slide. Take any object, make it to slide. So you can see this object freely moves, freely slides. It travels a distance and it falls. Now take one more surface. Which surface? That is a rough surface. One more surface. This is a rough surface compared to the previous one. This is bit soft and this is a rough surface. Make an inclined plane using rough surface and take the same object and make it to move. Just try to move the object. Is it possible whether it moves? Whether it moves, this object? This object is not moving. Why this object is not moving? Because here this surface is rough. Because of roughness of this surface, the surfaces between these two objects, they interlock together, which opposes the motion of this object. This object is not moving. Because of roughness of the surface, object is not moving. What does it shows? It shows rough surface has more friction. It opposes the motion. Rough surface has more friction compared to the soft polished surface. Even though if you consider a rough surface or a soft surface or a polished surface, I said friction is because of the irregularities present in the surfaces. When you consider a smooth surface, it has irregularities, it has minute irregularities. But when you take rough surface, the irregularities are more in this surface. Because of the more number of irregularities, the two surfaces, they come into contact with each other. They come into contact with each other and these irregularities lock into one another, which opposes the motion of the object, which opposes the movement of this object. So we can say rough surface has more friction and soft or shiny surface has less friction. So nature of the friction, nature of the surface depends on friction. Friction depends on nature of the surface. If the surface is rougher one, friction is more, and if the surface is soft, if the surface is smooth or if the surface is shiny, friction is less. Now we will try to understand how friction depends on mass of the object. So as mass of the object increases, friction also increases. To understand this, consider this simple activity. Take a table and a chair. So when you consider the mass of the chair and mass of the table, mass of the chair is very less. It is lesser than the mass of the table. Table has more mass and chair has less mass. So to make this chair to move, so when you apply force on this chair starts moving. So when I push this chair, when you push the chair moves. But if I apply same force on this table, if I push the table by applying force, if I push this table by applying force, whether table moves in that distance, whether it moves for the longer distance, it is not moving for the longer distance. Why? Because table has more mass, so the friction between this table and the ground is more. But when you consider this chair, the mass of the chair is less, so the frictional force which exists between the surface of this chair and the ground is less. So as the mass of the object is more, friction is also more. So you can consider one more example. It is easier to pull a mat or or to drag a mat if no one is sitting on the mat. Suppose if a person sits on a mat, you have to apply more force to drag the mat. So why this happens? As the mass increases, so the irregularities, they lock tighter, they lock one into another. Because of this, we cannot move these objects. So as the mass increases, friction also increases. So as the friction increases, movement gets retarded, the motion stops, or the speed of the object decreases. So the second factor, mass. As mass of the object increases, friction increases. There is more friction. If an object has more mass, the friction between two surfaces is also more. So now we will try to understand how friction depends on mass of the object by conducting this activity. Take a spring balance. So using the mass, give oscillation for the spring balance. I have taken a 50 grams mass, 50 grams. So try to give oscillations for this spring balance. When you start oscillating the spring balance, when you give oscillation, you can see the oscillations. Oscillations are faster, more oscillations. The oscillations are faster, more oscillations you can see. Now, I add more mass, one more 50 grams mass I am adding. So, we will see how this speed of oscillation changes. See the oscillations, the speed of the oscillations. It is bit less than the previous one. Speed of the oscillations is less because I added more mass. Now I add one more 50 grams. One more 50 grams. I increase the mass. See the oscillations again. So how the oscillation changed? It is still very less. The speed of the oscillation, number of the oscillations are very less. If you add one more 50 grams to this, and if you start giving oscillations, if you give the oscillations, see the oscillations, still it is very, very, very less. So, as you add more number of weight to this spring balance, the oscillations, the number of oscillations reduces, speed reduces. When we say the speed is less or the motion is retarded, motion stops or the speed of the motion decreases, what does it mean? It means friction is more there. So as you add more number of mass, as you add more mass to the spring balance, the oscillations goes on decreases, which shows that as mass of the object increases, friction also increases. As mass you increase, if you increase the mass of the object, friction between two surfaces increases. Now we will see the types of friction. There are mainly three types of friction. They are, first one is static friction, second one is sliding friction, and the third one is rolling friction. Three types of friction are static friction, sliding friction, and rolling friction. So we will see the first one. What is this static friction? So static means stationary, not moving. So if a body is not moving, or if a body is stationary position, if a body is in its stationary position, not moving, if you apply force on that body, then that body starts moving. So the force applied to make a stationary body to move, the force which is applied to make a stationary body to move, to make it to move, is called is the measure of static friction. Here object is moving. Object is moving with some speed. When the object is moving with some speed, you are applying force to make that object to move in the same speed. Continuously it is moving. When the object is already started its motion, to make it to move continuously, we are applying force. This is the measure of sliding friction. So as you know that it is easier to make a body which is already in motion, the body which is already moving, to make it to move in the same speed, it is a bit easier than the object which is at rest position to make it to move. So when the object is in the rest position, to make it to move, we have to apply more force. So when you compare this sliding friction and static friction, static friction is greater and sliding friction is a bit less. Sliding friction is lesser than the static friction, or static friction is greater than the sliding friction, because it is easy to make a body to move continuously with the same speed which is already started its motion. Therefore, static friction is more than the sliding friction. Now come to the third type of friction, that is rolling friction. So what is this rolling friction? It is when one body rolls over another body. When one body is rolling over another body, then the force which exists between the two surfaces, the opposing force or the resisting force, the force which opposes this motion is called as rolling friction. When one body rolls over another body, the opposition for this motion is the measure of rolling friction. When you compare sliding and rolling is easier than the sliding. Therefore, rolling friction is less than the sliding friction. So you can compare static friction, sliding friction and rolling friction. And what you can say, sliding friction, static friction is greater. Next comes sliding friction. Next comes the least one is the rolling friction. Rolling friction is minimum. It is very less. Rolling friction is lesser than sliding friction. Sliding friction is lesser than static friction. Static friction is greater than sliding friction. Sliding friction is more than rolling friction. So when you compare sliding and rolling friction is less. It is easy to roll an object. Rolling friction is less than the sliding friction. For the same reason, usually you can see the wheels in the luggages to carry the luggages which we use to carry the loads. So they are provided with the wheels. Why? Because easily we can drag that wheels. We can drag the suitcase using that wheels. Easily we can carry from one place to another. Than sliding, it is difficult to slide. Instead of that, wheels are provided so that easily we can take it from one place to another. Luggages are provided with the wheels. You might have seen in the luggages they have wheels so that easily we can drag them. And also in some of the machines, ball bearings are used. It is mainly to change this sliding for the rolling. Rolling friction is less. Therefore, ball bearings are used in bicycle as well as fans. Mainly for the to roll, because as I said, rolling friction is less. To reduce the friction, ball bearings are used in the fans as well as in the bicycle. So we have studied friction opposes the motion of the body. Friction decreases the speed of the object. But friction, when you consider this friction, it is very important in our life. Why friction is very important? Why friction is a necessary evil? Why it is very important? What are the advantages of friction? If there is no friction between my feet and the ground, I cannot stop on the ground. I cannot stand on the ground. If there is no friction, between my feet and the ground. If there is no friction between your pen and the book, you cannot write using the pen. In the book you cannot write. If there is no friction between this chalk piece and the board, I cannot write anything on the board. If there is no friction in the vehicles, if there is no friction, you cannot stop a vehicle or you cannot change the direction of the vehicles. So continuously they are moving. If a vehicle which is already started moving, you would never stop if there is no friction between the tires and the roads. So friction is very important in our life. If you want to change the direction of the vehicle, there should be friction between the tires and the roads. If you want to stop a vehicle, there should be friction between the tire and the road. And you cannot construct, it is not possible to construct a building if there is no friction. So friction is very important in our life. At the same time, friction has some of the disadvantages. So what are the disadvantages of this friction? When you use your shoes continuously, you might have seen the soles of the shoes wear out due to friction. The soles of the shoes, if you use continuously shoes, the sole of the shoes wear out because of the continuous use, because of the friction between the sole and the road. So they wear out because of the friction. And also friction produces heat. You might have seen in the matchstick, when to burn the matchstick you have to rub it using the matchbox. Because of the friction, heat is produced. But sometimes this heat, because of the friction, heat is produced. This leads to the wastage of energy. In some machines, because of the heat, energy gets wasted. Energy will be wasted. For example, you might have seen when you are using mixer for continuous 5 to 10 minutes, the mixer jar gets heated up. So heat is produced, which decreases the efficiency of machines. Because of this heat, efficiency of the machine decreases. The work done from the machine, we get less work using the machine. So these are the disadvantages of the friction. Friction has advantages, friction has disadvantages. Friction is our friend as well as friction is our foe because of these reasons. So as I said, friction is our friend as well as friction is foe. So in sometimes we have to increase the friction and sometimes we have to reduce the friction. So in some situation, friction should be increased. For example, as I said, soles of the shoes, they wear out because of the friction. So mainly to get the better grip with the sole and the ground, the soles of the shoes are mainly grooved. Soles of the shoes are grooved to get better grip between the soles as well as ground. And also you might have seen in tires, treating of tires in the tires which we are using in car as well as automobiles, mainly to provide better grip with the ground. And also increasing friction by using brake pads in the brake system of bicycle. Brake pads are used to increase the friction between increasing the friction of bicycle as well as automobiles. To increase the friction of the bicycle or any vehicle, brake pads are used in the brake system. And also you might have seen kabaddi players. They apply some substance, that is they rub their hands with the soil to get better grip on their opponents. To increase the friction, to get a better grip on their opponents, they apply some sand and they rub their hand with the sand. And also gymnasts, they apply some of the coarse substances on their hand to increase the friction. Some powder they apply to get better grip. To increase the friction, they use these substances. So in this way we can increase the friction. Now how to reduce the friction or how to minimize the friction? How friction can be reduced? So you might have seen by playing carom game. powder on the carrom board to reduce the friction. And also between the hinges of the doors we pour some drops of oil. Few drops of oil are poured into the hinges of the door so that door can be moved softly, smoothly. In bicycles and in motor, we apply grease to reduce the friction. To minimize the friction, grease can be used. As I said, in machines, if friction is more, their efficiency decreases. So, to increase the efficiency of the machines, we have to minimize their friction. So, the substances which are used to minimize, to reduce the friction in machines, we call them as lubricants. Lubricants are the substances which reduce the friction in the machines. They are called as lubricants because in machines, if friction is more, efficiency of the machines decreases. So, we have to decrease the friction by using lubricants. So, we have studied friction applied by the solid object or the solid body. Now, we will study fluid friction. So, what is this fluid friction? Fluid friction. Fluid in science, the common name given for gases and liquids is a fluid. Fluid is the common name given for gases and liquids. So, the friction exerted by these gases and liquids is called as fluid friction. Gases and liquids also apply friction. They also exert friction on the object which move through them. That is called as fluid friction. So, this fluid friction mainly depends on shape of the object and the speed of the object. Therefore, such a shape given should be given for the object. Mainly, we have to reduce the friction. To reduce the friction, we have to give the shapes. So, how we can give shape? Which shapes can be given for these vehicles which travel or which move through the gas as well as liquid? If you consider aeroplane. So, what is the shape of the aeroplane? When you compare aeroplane with that of bird, when you compare the shape of the aeroplane and shape of the bird, the shape of aeroplane and bird, they look similar, mainly to reduce the friction. When you compare the shape of sheep and shape of the fish, so their shapes are similar, mainly to reduce the friction. So for the vehicles, we have to give such a shape, mainly friction can be reduced. To reduce the friction, we are giving particular shape for the vehicles. It may be the vehicles move on the road, or it may be the vehicles which move in the air or as well as in the water. So mainly to reduce the friction, we are giving the shapes. So these shapes we get from the nature.